Hey YouTube, how's it going? Today I'm going to discuss Wonder Woman 1984, why it failed, and how it could have been better. I'm Nate, and this is my YouTube channel and my first video. If you like today's content, hit the like button or leave a comment or both. Wonder Woman 1984 was released on Christmas Day 2020 by Warner Brothers on the streaming service HBO Max. Gal Gadot reprises her role as Deanna Prince, Chris Pine as Steve Trevor. Pedro Pascal joins the cast as diabolic businessman Maxwell Lord, and Kristen Wiig plays socially awkward Barbara Minerva, who becomes a supervillain Cheetah. Behind the camera is Patty Jenkins directing again. She also wrote the script, along with former DC Chief Creative Officer Jeff Johns and screenwriter David Callahan. The movie had a budget of $200 million, but only made $166 million. As far as the plot, it's a standard 3-act blockbuster structure. We're presented with a question or a statement in the beginning that tells us what the movie is going to be about. A problem is interjected, the main character responds, and then we end with an epic battle. The main problem with the film is that the theme is proposed in the beginning, which is you can't always have what you want, is not what the movie is actually about. What comes out as the theme is you have to let go in order to grow. For much of the second act, Deanna and Steve spend their time getting to know each other. There's really no story there. When Deanna is finally confronted with the reality that her powers are waning because of her wish to have Steve back, she finally discovers that she has to let him go. The character development point is ambiguous and it lacks the emotional setup needed in order to get audience buy-in. The theme ends up missing the mark. The two ideas are similar. You can't always have what you want, and you have to let go in order to grow, but they have drastically different paths of growth. Another problem is that Deanna's waning powers don't wane enough. When Deanna starts to show signs of losing her powers, it's not significant enough to make us think that she's actually in danger. For example, in an early scene, she deflects bullets with her wrist cuffs. Later, when she gets shot, it's just a scratch. There's just not enough there. As far as the creative elements of the film, many comic books have eras that influence certain runs of their series that made them popular. A common thing for the comic books that have been made into films is to either be set in the past or have flashbacks to the past that reflect those series of the runs. This is most prominent in the film Guardians of the Galaxy, which harkens back to the 70s and the 80s with a lot of references and their catchy soundtrack. So it's no wonder that DC tried to give the gimmick a whirl as well. The unfortunate thing with Wonder Woman 1984 is that it's not very well done. It barely feels like 1984. The exception to this is a mall scene that takes place early in the movie that was actually filmed on a movie set mock-up of a mall. That movie set was used in a lot of 80s films, including Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Commando. Another use of this gimmick is when Steve tries on a bunch of different clothes from the 80s and Dana gives her critique. The unfortunate thing, despite the fact that the scene is slightly funny, it's just overindulgent and pointless. There were other elements that portrayed 80s culture, but nothing really brought me back to the world of the 1980s. I never found myself reminiscing. As far as the dialogue is concerned, it's overly excessive. In many of my screenwriting classes, the instructor will invariably tell us to cut our dialogue down even more than we have it. Wonder Woman 1984 feels like at least one character in every scene is monologuing. The worst is Barbara. She's supposed to be awkward, and the unfortunate thing is she's really awkward in this movie. It's like a bad episode of Family Guy where she nervously stutters to show her social ineptitude and then stutters for 10 minutes. Moving on to character development. Like I said before, the plot is a standard 3-act blockbuster structure, so it moves along and it hits its points, and that includes character development, but the points are not always obvious and significant enough to convey importance. For example, in the opening scene, the adventure race, Deanna cheats and nearly wins. She's pulled out of the race by her aunt and told she can't have everything she wants. Later, when she's holding the Mind Stone, she unwittingly wishes to have Steve Trevor back. The problem is that there's no active decision there. Unless, of course, Deanna is establishing that she's overcoming her own obliviousness, there's no use to this. Deanna doesn't believe the Mind Stone has power, and she makes the comment off the cuff. Then, in order to move into Act 3, she finally realizes that she must let Steve go because she's losing her powers, and she rescinds her wish. The decision to let Steve go is what her arc is actually about. And the reason why is because she actually gets what she wants. So her outer goal at the beginning of the movie is that she wants Steve, but her inner need is that she needs to let him go in order to move on. So she gets her outer goal in the beginning, and that's the problem that is interjected into the story. As far as the mood and the tone of the movie, it's really hard to pin down. The runtime for the movie was 2.5 hours. If there was a tone in there, it got lost in the excessive amount of dialogue. As far as the topic and its implementation, Wonder Woman 1984 tries too hard. The movie was about Diana Prince growing into Wonder Woman, not about her not getting what she wanted. The first film introduced her, and this film needed to move her into her superhero role. But all that gets lost because the movie doesn't know what it's about. The other issue is that it's bogged down in the filmmaker's attempt to give her commentary on toxic masculinity and Donald Trump rather than tell a story. I'd heard early on that Patty Jenkins' intentions for Maxwell Lord was to mimic Donald Trump. I went the entire movie asking myself when I was going to see it. Then I realized that I did see it. It's just that Patty Jenkins sees Donald Trump differently than I do. Because of this, the whole story suffers. The movie itself is constantly trying to land a foot in both story and commentary, but it ends up falling flat on its face. Superhero movies typically are rooted in cultural commentary, but the ones that fail are either too on the nose, too obvious, or miss a target, and this movie had all three of those. The biggest problem with this film, though, is Steve Trevor. Steve is killed in the first movie, so they have to figure out a way to bring him back, and he is introduced back into this world through the Mind Stone. Steve's spirit, or his consciousness, is brought back to life in the body of another man. It's pointed out that only Deanna and the audience can see Steve Trevor, but the rest of the world only sees the unnamed man. Eventually, Deanna has sex with Steve, or rather the unnamed man, but nothing ever comes of this. The biggest question throughout the movie is what happened to this other guy? This is hugely problematic and it paints Deanna in a bad light. The film is rife with references of men behaving badly and being rapey, only to have this unnamed man being forced to have sex without consent. Ultimately, it proposes a question. Are we souls or are we bodies, or both? In the book Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis attempts to explain why there is suffering in the world. Along the way, he addresses this issue of the body and the spirit, particularly in chapter 2. If we were just souls, we'd be flopping around the spirit world, according to Lewis. We'd have no way of telling the difference between ourselves or others. Our thoughts and our feelings would be the same as other people's thoughts and feelings, and we lack total self-awareness of who we are. Lewis posits that the physical world is how we interact, how we define ourselves apart from others and God. Interaction is how we become self-aware and how we grow. We are both spirit and body. With that being said, being put into another body would potentially change us. Just look at movies like Freaky Friday and vice versa. When Steve gets put into this unnamed man's body and there are no repercussions, it's an obvious hang-up for most people. What would happen to both Steve and the unnamed man while they were trying to occupy the same body? That's the question that everybody wants to know. If I was going to make Wonder Woman 1984 a good movie, here's what I'd do. 1. I'd shorten the runtime. Many scenes are just too long or unnecessary. A script doctor could easily edit this script and shorten it up by cutting out unnecessary dialogue and keeping scenes on theme. 2. I'd restate the theme at the beginning. The movie is about letting go in order to grow. The opening scene should have Diana not letting go of something in order to win the race, maybe her horse. 3. I'd have Deanna's wish be more active. Instead of her nonchalantly making a wish for Steve to return, she should be overwhelmed with temptation and actually seek to make a wish with a vengeance. 4. Get rid of the unnamed man. When Steve's spirit returns, he should occupy the body of Maxwell Lord, but it's a benign Maxwell Lord. As Deanna and Steve reconnect, it would become apparent that Steve is fighting with Maxwell on the inside. Both are starting to lose who they are. Then Steve would cry out to Diana to release him from her wish, but she doesn't want to let him loose, and so it takes a while. 5. Once Steve has been released and Max has full control of his body again, I'd have Max unable to cope with that. He would know Steve is a better man, and that would bother him. He would then start to take on some of Steve's better traits, but instead of these traits coming out as positive, they would manifest as evil. Whereas Steve loves Diana, Maxwell hates her. To get back at Diana for doing this to him, I'd have Max find the Mind Stone and then make his wish to become it, to gain its power. All of Max's ambitions would get amplified, and that's when we would see him become greedy and turn into the supervillain Maxwell Lord that's in the comics. 5. Barbara should be the main villain. She represents the polar opposite of Diana. Diana should see her own failings in Barbara, and this pushes Diana to become Wonder Woman. 7. Barbara should want to kill Diana just like Maxwell does, but for a different reason. Diana is no longer someone Barbara wants to be. She's the competition, and the only way for Barbara to win is to kill Diana. 8. As the story goes into Act 3, Diana must fight a man who diabolically mirrors the love of her life and a woman who literally wants to be Diana and ended up becoming a twisted version of her. Ultimately, this film should have been about letting go in order to grow, but the arc should have focused intently on Diana fully becoming Wonder Woman. Overall, I thought this movie was a complete mess. Thanks for watching, and if you liked today's content, please hit the like button or leave a comment.